I've talked in previous segments about the abuse of power and out of control spending at the national level. In this segment, I will discuss one of the changes to our Constitution that has facilitated that expansive power, namely the 16th Amendment. I believe the 16th Amendment was the worst amendment we have passed because it gave the federal government the ability to tax citizens directly and disproportionately. Why was this a bad idea? It was the first amendment to stray from the principles of limited government, and it incorporated socialistic principles that have had disastrous effects for freedom and economics around the world. Let's start with a little history of taxation in America. The founders were very leery of a direct tax. Now, how did the founders define a direct tax? Well, it was either a tax on people, a capitation or poll tax, sometimes called a head tax, or a tax on property, specifically land, but sometimes extending to buildings and other property. The original Constitution put limits on Congress's power to levy a direct tax. In Article 1, Section 9, it states, "No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken." The founders didn't like direct taxation, so limited it to be in proportion to the census of the states to prevent abuse. In other words, a direct tax was based on population of the states and was collected by the states. Why didn't they like direct taxes? As Chief Justice John Marshall stated, the power to tax involves the power to destroy. A federal direct tax on people, land, or manufacturing could destroy people and industry. Additionally, by encouraging indirect taxes, there was less chance of mischief in Congress by targeting specific people. It was thought that head taxes and property taxes were likely to be abused and that they bore no relation to the activities in which the federal government had a legitimate interest. What did it mean that taxes must be in proportion to the census? Well, if a state like Virginia had 10% of the population of the United States per the census, their portion of the direct tax would be 10% of the revenue needed. Ever on guard against the power of the central government to eclipse that of the states, the collection of direct taxes was usually left as the responsibility of the state governments. The proportionality aspect is what forced the government to pass the 16th Amendment, because obviously a direct income tax is in no way proportional. By the way, since the power to tax was a power to destroy, that is the reason the church has always been exempt from taxation from our government from the very beginning. The founders followed Ezra 7:24, which says, "We also inform you that it is not allowed to impose tax, tribute, or toll on any of the priests or servants of the house of God." When church tax exemption was challenged, the Supreme Court said, all of the 50 states provide for tax exemption of places of worship, most of them doing so by constitutional guarantees. Few concepts are more deeply embedded in the fabric of our national life, beginning with pre-revolutionary colonial times. That is one of the time the courts got it right. Well, back to the 16th Amendment. It states, "Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived without apportionment among the several states and without regard to any census or enumeration." Again, was this a bad thing? There are several big reasons why it was bad. First, it allowed the federal government to bypass the states in collecting taxes. Previously, any direct tax was collected by the states and sent to the federal government. Any outrageous policies could be mitigated by the states who collected and held the money. Today, the federal government reigns supreme regardless of their overreach because they control all the money. This has severely weakened the power of the states to the point where they are almost entirely controlled by the federal government. destroying the balancing principle of federalism. The states receive a small portion of our tax dollars back from the federal government with strings attached, and we think it's a good thing. Second, the 16th Amendment gave the federal government an enormous source of income to fuel all their unconstitutional socialistic programs. For the first 150 years prior to the 16th Amendment, federal revenues and expenditures hovered around 2% of the nation's gross national product, with exceptions during periods of war. Now it's above 25%. Additionally, the progressive income tax has created a rich versus poor mentality in Americans. The constant refrain that the rich don't pay their fair share is not only untrue, but creates a constant political divide. Currently, the top 1% income earners pay over 25% of all federal income taxes. The top 20% pay 66%, and the bottom 50% pay only 2%. Yet we constantly hear that the rich don't pay their fair share, when the lower incomes not only pay nothing, but most get some sort of payments from the government. Only with a socialistic mentality can this be called fair. So how did the federal government get their revenues before the income tax? The nation had few taxes in its early history. Tariffs were the largest source of federal revenue from the 1790s to the eve of World War I, until it was surpassed by the income tax. The Tariff Act of 1789 was the first major act passed in the United States. It authorized the collection of tariff and tonnage duties to meet the operating costs of the new central government, to provide funds to pay the interest and principals on Revolutionary War debts inherited from the Continental Congress. It also provided a degree of protection from foreign commerce. Though social policies sometimes governed the course of tax policy, even in the early days of the Republic, the nature of these policies did not extend either to the collection of taxes so as to equalize incomes and wealth, or for the purpose of redistributing income or wealth. As Thomas Jefferson once wrote, "To take from one because it is thought his own industry and that of his father has acquired too much, in order to spare to others who, or whose fathers, had not exercised equal industry and skill, is to violate arbitrarily the first principle of association, which is to guarantee to everyone a free exercise of his industry and the fruits acquired by it." There have been a couple of times before the 16th Amendment that Congress passed an income tax. One was during the Civil War, which was quickly repealed after the end of the war. The next time was in the late 1800s, but then the court still interpreted the Constitution how it was written, and the court struck it down as unconstitutional. The 16th Amendment took away that aspect of proportionality. The other thing it did was to give the federal government a direct line to the citizens so that it could control them. You have heard of all the horror stories of fines, penalties, garnished wages, etc. that the government imposes when someone doesn't pay their taxes. It goes way beyond the latest stories of the IRS targeting conservative groups. Literally, with the income tax, the government really owns you and your money. They just decide how much of it you get to keep. We have become so used to the federal government being in our business, we don't stop to think what tyranny it is that they need to know every penny that I've ever made and what I do with my money. That is not liberty. The income tax has created a mechanism to expand the scope of the federal government. Without the ability to tax, they couldn't do all the socialistic programs they are now doing. In fact, the stated purpose of the progressives for passing the 16th Amendment was not so much as a way to raise revenues, but as a way to bring about, quote, social justice. Contrary to the principle just stated by Jefferson, the country had then bought into the false communistic notion that we needed to take away from the rich and give to the poor to be equitable. The graduated income tax is the second major plank of the Communist Manifesto. And Karl Marx said that an aggressive and progressive income tax is needed to destroy capitalism. In America, they labeled themselves as progressives instead of communists so that gullible Americans would swallow their propaganda. The income tax was targeted towards the wealthy. In the first few years, only about 2% of households paid any income tax. Tax rates of only 1 to 7% prevented it from generating significant revenues. Of course, that changed quickly. The highest tax brackets have varied since the inception of the income tax. Roosevelt wanted the highest tax rate to be 99%. How's that for incentive to go make more money when the government keeps 99 cents on the dollar? Government spending is currently a major portion of the total U.S. economy. Today, federal government expenditures comprise about 26% of total economic output. Before the income tax in the late 1800s, government expenditures were responsible for only about 2% of national output, as you can see from the graph. Unfortunately, most of the state governments have followed suit with an income tax, so state government expenditures have also risen to the point where total government expenditures are about 35% of gross domestic product. Government is virtually sucking the life out of the country through the income tax. In my opinion, that is why we need to abolish the 16th Amendment. In one of my future segments on solutions to our problems, I will discuss the idea of amending the Constitution.